I knew something was off the moment he walked in. Not when the stock dipped last quarter. Not when they replaced real coffee with that overpriced organic sludge that tasted like regret. No, this was different. This was the kind of shift you feel in your bones before anything actually breaks. His name was Adrian Cole, 29, newly appointed CTO of Virex Systems. Straight from some venture-backed rocket ship that hadn't yet learned gravity exists, he walked into the conference room like he owned not just the company, but the laws of physics holding it together. I sat in the corner, hoodie on, quietly sipping lukewarm coffee. 6 years in this company had turned me into background noise until it hadn't. If you think what he did next would spark a fire that burned everything to the ground, then hit the like button and keep listening. Because this story, it's not what you expect. Tell me, where are you listening from right now? What's the temperature there? Now, let me tell you exactly what he said next. Let's be honest, Adrian said, clapping his hands like he was starting a TED Talk nobody asked for. This entire architecture, it's outdated, monolithic, inefficient. We're rebuilding from scratch microservices, AI-driven optimization, full cloud native by Q3. Slides flashed, circles, arrows, buzzwords stacked like a house of cards. Then I saw it. He was planning to remove the core processing layer, the system that handled nearly everything, the system I built. I raised my hand, my voice cutting through the room after months of silence. If you remove that layer, I said, you're not optimizing anything. You're shutting down 90% of vendor compliance overnight. The room went still. Adrian turned to me slowly, scanning me like I was an outdated file he was about to delete. And you are, he asked, though I knew he'd seen my name, Karis Dean. I replied, I built the system you're calling obsolete. He smiled. Not the kind that reaches the eyes. Right, he said lightly. Well, Karis, we're not running a museum. That code might have worked once, but now it's just holding us back. A few people looked down at their laptops. Others avoided eye contact. I leaned back in my chair, watching him turn away, already dismissing me. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just a bad decision. It was the beginning of a collapse he didn't even see coming. I want to be clear about something. This is a fictional story. Some moments have been enhanced with the help of AI to make it more vivid and engaging, but at its core, it's about something real, the lessons hidden inside. Now, let's continue. He didn't wait for anyone to respond. Adrian turned back to the screen and kept talking, throwing around phrases like scalability, velocity, and future-proofing, as if saying them fast enough would make them true. I didn't interrupt again, not because I agreed with him, but because I didn't need to. There are moments in your career when you realize arguing is pointless, not because you're wrong, but because the other person doesn't even understand the question yet. And Adrian, he wasn't even close. What he saw was a system. What I saw was leverage. Most people in that room thought I was just another senior engineer who had been around too long. The kind you keep out of habit, not necessity. The kind you quietly phase out when someone younger, louder, and more innovative shows up. They didn't know the truth. Back in 2019, when Virex Systems was barely holding itself together, they couldn't afford to hire me full-time. They needed something more than a developer. They needed someone to build a system that wouldn't collapse under pressure. So I gave them a different offer. Instead of signing a traditional employment contract, I set up my own company, Obsidian Core Labs. Through that entity, I designed and built the entire backbone of their logistics engine, not as an employee, as a vendor. The agreement was simple on the surface. They paid for access. I retained ownership. It wasn't a salary. It was a licensing model. Just like you don't own the software you install on your computer. Virex didn't own the system that kept their operations alive. They were renting it, quietly, continuously, quarter after quarter. And buried deep inside that agreement were terms most people never bothered to read. Terms about modification, terms about unauthorized access, terms about what happens when payments stop. I remembered the day the contract was signed. The original CEO had shaken my hand like he knew exactly how important that document was. Legal had reviewed every line. Finance had approved every clause. But leadership changes. Memory doesn't. And arrogance has a way of skipping the fine print. Adrian didn't see any of that. To him, I was just a name on payroll, a line item he could erase to free up budget. He didn't realize that the system he was planning to tear apart didn't belong to the company at all. It belonged to me. I leaned back slightly, watching him redraw architecture diagrams that looked impressive, but ignored the invisible dependencies holding everything together. Removing one part wouldn't just optimize the system, it would destabilize everything built on top of it. But I stayed quiet, because the truth is, I wasn't worried about his plan failing. I was curious how far he would take it. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't stopping someone from making a mistake. It's letting them commit to it completely. Around me, the room had already shifted. People were nodding, taking notes, pretending this all made sense. They always do. No one wants to be the person who questions confidence, even when that confidence is built on nothing. I glanced down at my phone briefly. The date, the timing, everything lined up in a way that made my chest feel strangely calm. There was a clause in that contract, one most people would overlook unless they were specifically looking for it, and I knew exactly what would trigger it. Adrian thought he was redesigning a system. What he was actually doing was stepping into a position he didn't even realize existed. By the time the meeting ended, Adrian wasn't asking for approval anymore. He was issuing direction. Effective immediately, he said, clicking to his final slide. We're initiating a full structural reset. Legacy modules will be sunsetted. We're rebuilding the core from the ground up. The room stayed quiet, but not because people agreed. It was the kind of silence that comes from calculation. Everyone was doing the same thing at once, measuring risk, adjusting posture, deciding how visible they wanted to be in whatever came next. HR will coordinate transitions. Adrian continued, almost casually. We need a team aligned with the new vision, lean, adaptable, forward-thinking. There it was. Transitions. Corporate language has a way of softening impact, but everyone in that room understood exactly what it meant. People were going to be removed, not based on performance, not based on contribution, based on relevance to a plan that hadn't even proven it could work. I watched as a few heads lowered slightly, fingers tapping faster on keyboards that suddenly felt less permanent. Others nodded along, eager to be seen agreeing. Survival instincts kick in fast when uncertainty enters the room. Adrian looked energized. He thrived in that moment, standing at the front like he was conducting an orchestra only he could hear. He pointed at the whiteboard, sketching over existing diagrams I had built years ago, replacing them with simplified flows that ignored half the system's complexity. This, he said, circling a rough diagram, is where we start cutting this entire layer redundant. It wasn't. That layer handled real-time vendor validation across multiple regions. Removing it wouldn't simplify anything. It would break processes that took years to stabilize. But no one said a word, because saying something now meant putting a target on your back. And Adrian had already decided what he wanted to see. By the next morning, the shift had begun. Calendar invites started disappearing. Weekly architecture syncs were canceled without explanation. New meetings appeared, but only certain names were included. I noticed patterns quickly. The engineers who had been there the longest, the ones who actually understood how things worked under pressure, were being quietly excluded. In their place, new faces started appearing. Fresh hires, bright resumes, clean sneakers. People who spoke confidently about systems they hadn't yet touched. Adrian introduced them like upgrades. This is Noah, he said during one stand-up, gesturing toward a young guy who looked barely out of school. He'll be helping drive the new microservices transition. Noah smiled, eager and slightly overwhelmed, holding a tablet like it was a shield. He stopped by my desk later that afternoon. Hey, Karis. Right, he said. Adrian mentioned you worked on the, Older infrastructure. I'd love to get a quick rundown before we start decommissioning parts of it. Older infrastructure. I turned my chair slowly to face him. Do you know what happens when you remove a dependency chain without mapping its fallback conditions? I asked. He blinked. I mean, we'll migrate it. Right. That's what the cloud's for. I held his gaze for a second, then turned back to my screen. Good luck, I said quietly. He lingered for a moment, unsure whether that had been advice or a warning, then walked away. By midweek, access permissions started changing, not dramatically, subtly. Certain environments required additional approval. Some tools became restricted. My credentials still worked, but not everywhere they used to. I didn't question it. I didn't escalate. I simply observed, because the pattern was becoming clearer with each passing day. Adrian wasn't just replacing a system, he was replacing the people who knew how to protect it. And once that knowledge was gone, once the safeguards were stripped away and the wrong hands started pulling at the wrong threads, there wouldn't be anything left to stop what was coming next. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, almost politely, like something pretending not to be a problem. The first thing to go was visibility. Meetings I had been part of for years simply stopped appearing on my calendar. No explanation, no notification, just gone. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a scheduling glitch, but then it kept happening. Architecture reviews, system integrity check-ins, even the weekly incident briefings I used to lead. I could still hear them. Though, the conference room was 10 feet away from my desk, separated by a glass wall that did nothing to hide what was happening inside. Laughter, voices, Adrian's voice, mostly. Confident, loud, certain, through the glass. I watched him stand where I used to stand, pointing at diagrams I had drawn months ago. Only now. They were being erased, replaced with simplified flows and vague concepts that sounded impressive, but meant very little in practice. No one invited me in. No one asked why. That was the second thing to disappear. Curiosity. People I had worked with for years stopped making eye contact. Conversations ended when I walked into the break room. Lunch plans happened without me. It wasn't personal. It was instinct. In environments like this, proximity to someone being phased out feels dangerous. If you stand too close, you risk being associated, and association, in moments like these, can be enough to put your name on the same list. So they distance themselves, quietly, efficiently, like everything else in that building. By Tuesday afternoon, the system notifications started changing, permissions updated, access modified, generic messages, automated, impersonal. I tested a few endpoints out of habit. Some still worked, others didn't. The staging environment, which I had full control over just days ago, now required approval from someone else. I didn't ask who. I already knew. Adrian wasn't cutting me off completely. Not yet. That would come later. Once the transition was fully in place, for now, he was reducing my footprint, limiting exposure, making sure I couldn't interfere with whatever version of reality he was building. It was methodical and effective. By Wednesday, I had become something I hadn't been in years, irrelevant. I sat at my desk, surrounded by systems I had designed, processes I had optimized, safeguards I had built layer by layer over time. And yet, none of it seemed to belong to me anymore. Not in their eyes. A new hire took over part of the monitoring dashboard that I used to manage. Another was assigned to audit components of the core system without fully understanding how those components interacted. I watched them work, not with frustration, with curiosity, because every change they made, every adjustment they tested, every assumption they acted on without context, it all added up, not immediately, but inevitably. Late that afternoon, another notification appeared. Access revoked staging environment. No explanation, no follow-up, just a quiet removal of control. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen for a moment longer than necessary. 6 years. 6 years of building, refining, protecting. And now, I was being phased out of it piece by piece, as if none of it required context to maintain, as if systems like this just ran on their own. I closed the notification and reached for my personal laptop, the one they didn't control, the one that connected to something far more important than their internal network. Not to act. Not yet. Just to observe from a different angle. Because what they were doing inside that building, it wasn't just restructuring. It was erasing the only layer of understanding that kept everything stable. And once that layer was gone, once I was completely removed from their version of the system, they wouldn't even realize what they had lost until it was far too late to fix it. It didn't hit me all at once. There was no dramatic alert, no flashing red warning telling me something had gone wrong. It was quieter than that. A missing transaction. I noticed it late Thursday afternoon while checking something unrelated. Out of habit. I logged into the Obsidian Core Labs account portal, the one tied to the licensing agreement. I didn't expect anything unusual. The system had been running like this for years. Payments came in automatically, processed by finance without anyone needing to think about it. That's how it's supposed to work. Until it doesn't. I refreshed the page once, then again. The expected payment wasn't there. At first, I assumed it was a delay. Internal processing lag. Maybe someone in finance was late approving invoices. It happens. Companies slow down when leadership shifts. Systems get messy when priorities change. But something about it felt off. I checked the date. End of quarter. Payment deadline midnight. I leaned back slightly, thinking through the chain of responsibility. The previous CFO had handled this personally. He understood the contract. He understood why that payment mattered. He was gone now, restructured, replaced by someone who probably saw a recurring invoice and thought it was just another expense to review, maybe even cut. Or worse, ignored entirely. I opened the contract file, not the summarized version, the full agreement, every clause, every condition, every line written with deliberate precision. Clause 3.1 Payment Obligations. Licensing fees must be remitted in full before the due date to maintain uninterrupted service rights. Clause 3.2. Failure to remit constitutes a material breach. No grace period, no negotiation window, just a clean line between compliance and violation. I stared at that section for a moment longer than necessary. Then I scrolled further. Clause 4. Unauthorized modification or interference with the system without explicit approval from the licensor results in immediate suspension eligibility. I let out a quiet breath. Because that had already happened. Adrian's team had been making changes all week, adjusting layers they didn't fully understand, testing integrations without proper access credentials. They weren't just redesigning. They were violating terms they didn't even know existed. And now, they were about to stack a second violation on top of it, non-payment. I checked the account again. Still nothing. By Friday morning, the situation hadn't changed. No pending transaction, no communication, no acknowledgement. It wasn't an oversight anymore. It was a decision, whether intentional or not. They had chosen not to pay. I could have said something, walked into Adrian's office, asked a simple question, pointed out the risk, given them a chance to correct it before it escalated. But I didn't, because I remembered the meeting. I remembered the way he said outdated, the way he dismissed years of work without understanding what it did, the way he looked at me like I was the problem, not the system he was about to dismantle. So I stayed quiet, not out of spite, out of clarity. This wasn't my responsibility to fix. I had built the system, I had defined the terms, I had ensured everything was documented, protected, enforceable. If they chose to ignore it, then the consequences were theirs to carry. By late Friday afternoon, the office felt different, tense, but unaware. People moved like nothing had changed. Meetings still happened. Conversations still flowed. Adrian walked through the floor with the same confidence, already talking about timelines and progress, as if everything was under control. I watched it all from my desk, calm, detached, because I knew something they didn't. There's a point in every system where failure becomes inevitable, not immediate, but guaranteed. And they had just crossed it. They just didn't know it yet. But they were about to find out. The message came in at 3:52 p.m. Subject line, quick sync. Location meeting room, C. Time 4:15 p.m. Short, clean, predictable. There's a pattern to these things. You don't get fired on a Monday morning. You don't get fired in the middle of a project. You get fired late on a Friday, when the office is already halfway mentally checked out and no one wants to deal with the aftermath. I stared at the notification for a few seconds, then closed it without reacting. Around me, the office hummed like nothing was about to happen. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, someone laughing near the break room. The kind of normal that only exists right before something breaks. I opened my drawer and started packing. Not much. A few personal items. A screwdriver set I'd kept since my first year. A small plant that had somehow survived the air conditioning longer than most people survived management changes. I powered down my company laptop. Not just shut it off. I wiped it, clean. System reset. Secure erase. Not because I had anything to hide, but because I don't leave loose ends behind. Ever. At 4:12, I stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked toward meeting room C. Glass walls. Of course. Everything visible. Everything staged. Inside, Adrian was already there, leaning against the table with his arms crossed like he was waiting for a performance to start. Next to him sat Melissa from HR. She gave me a small, practiced smile. The kind designed to soften something that couldn't actually be softened. Karis. "Thanks for coming," she said gently. I sat down across from them, placing my bag on the floor. Adrian didn't waste time. "We've been reviewing team alignment," he began, his tone measured, rehearsed. "And as we move forward with the new architecture, it's clear that your current role doesn't fit the direction we're heading." I nodded slightly, letting him continue. "This isn't about performance," he added quickly, as if that made it better. "It's about evolution. We need people who are aligned with where we're going, not where we've been." Melissa slid a folder across the table. "Here's your separation package," she said. 2 weeks compensation, along with standard documentation. We'll also need your badge and company equipment." I didn't touch the folder, instead. I looked at Adrian. "Just to confirm," I said calmly, "you're terminating my role entirely." "Yes," he replied without hesitation. Effective immediately. There was no doubt in his voice, no second thought. He believed this was a clean cut, a necessary move, a simple decision. I reached into my bag and placed my badge on the table. Then the laptop. "Understood," I said. Melissa shifted slightly, waiting for resistance that never came. Adrian watched me closely now, maybe expecting a reaction, anger, frustration, something he could justify. But there was nothing, because he still didn't understand what he had just done. "Security will escort you out," he added, almost as an afterthought. I stood up slowly, then paused. "Before I go," I said, resting my hand lightly on the table, "I just want to be clear about something." Adrian frowned slightly. "What you're ending our entire professional relationship," I continued. "No ongoing responsibilities, no expectations." "That's correct," he said, impatience creeping into his voice. "You're no longer part of this company." I nodded once. "All right," I said quietly. I picked up my bag and turned toward the door. Behind me, I could feel it, the certainty, the assumption that this was over, that they had removed a problem, that everything ahead would be smoother, faster, better. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. People glanced up briefly, then looked away. They always do. I walked past my desk without stopping, past the systems still running on code they thought they owned, past the team that no longer saw me as part of it. No one followed, no one asked, and just like that, I was gone. What Adrian didn't realize was that he hadn't just fired an employee. He had just removed the only person standing between his decisions and their consequences. The hallway air felt colder than it should have. I made it halfway toward the elevators before I stopped. Not because I hesitated, because something wasn't finished yet. I turned around. Through the glass walls of Meeting Room C, I could still see Adrian and Melissa inside. Melissa was organizing papers. Adrian was already on his phone, probably moving on to the next strategic decision of the day. That was the problem. He thought this was done. I walked back. The door opened without a sound, and both of them looked up. Surprised? "I thought you were leaving," Adrian said, irritation already creeping into his voice. "I am," I replied calmly, stepping back inside. "We're done with the employment part." Melissa paused, unsure whether to intervene. Adrian folded his arms again. "Then, what is this?" I placed my bag on the table and pulled out a thin folder. "This," I said, setting it down between us, "is the part you forgot." He glanced at it briefly, unimpressed. "Karis, if this is about negotiating your severance—" "It's not," I interrupted. I opened the folder and turned it toward him. At the top was the licensing agreement. Signed, stamped, dated years before he ever stepped into this company. "You should read paragraph 4, I said. Adrian didn't move at first. Then, almost reluctantly, he picked up the document. I watched his eyes scan the page. Slowly at first, then again. Faster. "This," he started, then stopped. Melissa leaned slightly closer, trying to follow along. "What exactly is this?" Adrian asked, though his tone had already shifted. "It's the agreement between Virex Systems and Obsidian Core Labs," I replied. "The company that owns the system you've been calling outdated." "That's not possible," he said immediately. "Anything built here belongs to the company. Standard IP assignment." "Normally, yes," I said, but I wasn't hired under a standard agreement. I tapped the document lightly. "I licensed the system to Virex. I never transferred ownership." Silence. Real silence this time. Not the kind filled with tension, the kind filled with realization, trying to catch up to denial. Adrian flipped through the pages. Faster now, searching for something that would prove me wrong. "There has to be an amendment," he muttered. "A transfer clause. Something." "There isn't," I said. Melissa spoke up carefully. "Karis, are you saying the company doesn't actually own the core system I'm saying?" I replied, keeping my voice steady. "The company has been paying for the right to use it, nothing more." Adrian shook his head, almost laughing. "This is outdated paperwork," he said. "From before the company scaled. These things get absorbed. Legal standardizes everything. Then you should probably ask legal why this one wasn't." I said. I pointed to another section. Clause 3, Payment Obligations. He didn't want to read it, but he did. And I saw it. That exact moment, when the meaning landed, failure to remit payment constitutes material breach. He read quietly. Melissa's expression changed. "Adrian," she said under her breath. I didn't give him time to recover. "You also authorized modifications to the system without licensor approval," I added. "That's another violation. That's not he started." "It is," I said, meeting his eyes. "You've been restructuring something you don't own." The room felt smaller now. Adrian set the document down harder than necessary. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're overplaying your position. Even if this were true, we'd just transition away from it." "You could try," I said. "If you had the time." He frowned. "What does that mean?" I glanced at the clock on the wall. "Your licensing payment was due," I said. "It hasn't been processed." Melissa's head snapped toward him. "Is that accurate?" Adrian didn't answer. He didn't know. That was the worst part. He didn't even know. "Without payment," I continued. "The agreement enters breach status." I let that sit for a moment. Then I added, quietly, "And once that happens, The system doesn't belong to you anymore in any functional sense. Adrian stared at me, the confidence from earlier finally cracking. You're saying you can just… What? Shut it down. I picked up my folder. I'm saying, I replied, you've already triggered the conditions that make that possible. Melissa looked between us, now fully alert. Adrian didn't speak. Not immediately, because for the first time since he walked into that building, he wasn't in control of the situation anymore. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to explain. I walked out of the building for the second time that day. But this time, it felt different. Not like I had been removed, but like I had stepped outside of something that was already starting to crack from within. The air hit differently. Lighter, cleaner. I reached my car, dropped my bag onto the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment without starting the engine. No rush, no panic, just silence, because everything that needed to be set in motion already had been. I drove home through familiar streets, the kind you stop noticing after years of routine. Traffic lights, storefronts, people moving through their own small worlds, unaware that somewhere across town, a system they depended on was about to fail in a way they wouldn't understand. Back in my apartment, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check messages. I went straight to my desk. My real desk, the one they didn't know existed. I opened my personal laptop, the old machine I trusted more than any corporate-issued device. Within seconds, I was inside the Obsidian Core Labs control panel. Clean interface, minimal design, no unnecessary visuals, just status indicators, all green. Inventory module active, vendor validation active, transaction routing active. The entire backbone of Virex systems, quietly running exactly as designed. I navigated to the licensing dashboard. Status grace period. Time remaining 47 hours. They hadn't paid, and they hadn't fixed the breach, which meant the system had already started its countdown. I leaned back slightly, studying the screen. This wasn't sabotage. That's the part most people would misunderstand. I wasn't hacking anything. I wasn't breaking into their systems or inserting malicious code. Everything that was about to happen was already written, predefined, documented, agreed upon. The system didn't need me to act. It just needed me not to stop it. I opened the enforcement settings. There it was, a simple toggle. Grace mode to strict compliance. In grace mode, the system tolerated delays. It allowed temporary inconsistencies, assuming payment or correction would follow. In strict compliance, it didn't. No payment meant no license. No license meant no execution. Clean, binary, final. I hovered over the setting for a moment, not hesitating, just acknowledging the weight of it, because once it was switched, there would be no gradual failure, no warning signs obvious enough for them to fix in time, just a system that would continue running, right up until the moment it didn't. I clicked. The status updated instantly. Strict compliance enabled. I exhaled slowly. Then I moved to the next tab. Heartbeat verification, every hour. Virex's servers sent a request to mine. A simple question. Are we still authorized for 6 years? The answer had always been yes. Soon, it wouldn't be. I queued the final condition. License validation scheduled for peak load, Monday, 8 a.m., right when their system would be under maximum pressure, right when failure would be impossible to ignore. I didn't rush it. I didn't trigger anything immediately, because this wasn't about causing damage. It was about enforcing reality. I closed the panel and sat back, letting the quiet settle in around me. My phone buzzed once on the desk. A message, unknown number. I didn't open it, not yet. Instead, I stood up, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. Simple, ordinary. The kind of moment that doesn't feel like anything important is happening. But it was. Because somewhere inside that building, Adrian was still planning, still moving forward with his redesign, still convinced he had control. He didn't know the clock had already started. He didn't know the system he was trying to replace was the only thing keeping everything stable. And he definitely didn't know that come Monday morning, the system wouldn't fail because I attacked it. It would fail because he broke the only agreement that allowed it to exist in the first place. Monday morning didn't arrive with noise. It arrived quietly, almost politely, like any other start to the week. I woke up without an alarm for the first time in years. No notifications pulling me out of sleep, no dashboards waiting for attention, no emergency calls about systems under stress, just silence. I made coffee, real coffee, sat by the window, watched the city ease into motion. 7:52 a.m. I didn't rush. There was no reason to. By now, their teams would be logging in, warehouses syncing inventory, automated procurement cycles preparing to trigger, thousands of background processes lining up like clockwork. Everything would look normal. Right up until it didn't. I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop. The Obsidian Core Labs panel loaded instantly, all systems still green. For now, I glanced at the clock again. 7:59 a.m. There's a moment, right before a system hits peak load, where everything tightens. You can't see it unless you've built something like this, but you feel it. Threads aligning, requests stacking, dependencies preparing to fire in sequence. That moment had arrived. 8 a.m. The first check executed, on my screen. A single line updated. License validation failed. It didn't look dramatic. No flashing warnings, no alarms, just a status change. But behind that single line, everything started to shift. Inventory module unauthorized. Vendor validation access denied. Transaction routing suspended. The green lights didn't turn red all at once. They flickered, one by one, then all together. I leaned back slightly, watching the cascade unfold. It was precise. Every component that relied on the licensed core began rejecting operations, not crashing, not corrupting, just refusing to function, which, in a system like theirs, is worse, because nothing breaks loudly enough to fix. It just stops working. My phone buzzed. Once, twice, then continuously. Unknown numbers, internal extensions, names I recognized. I let it ring. Instead, I watched the logs. 8:03 a.m. Error reports started flooding in. Authentication failures, data mismatches, unresolved dependencies. Warehouse scanners couldn't validate inventory. Shipment manifests returned blank. Automated purchase orders failed to generate. Every process that depended on the system stalled. 8:07 a.m. Another wave. Customer-facing platforms began timing out. Orders stuck in pending states. Payment gateways rejecting transactions without explanation. Thousands of requests per minute, all of them hitting the same wall. No authorization, no execution. 8:12 a.m. I imagined the scene inside Virex systems. Screens lighting up with errors no one fully understood. Developers refreshing dashboards, thinking it was a temporary glitch. Managers asking for updates that didn't exist yet. Adrian standing somewhere in the middle of it, trying to force clarity into a situation he couldn't control. Because this wasn't a bug. It wasn't a failure of infrastructure. It was a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Enforce. 8:18 a.m. A message finally came through that I recognized. Noah. Karis, are you seeing this? Everything is down. We can't process anything. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say that would help him now, because help required access, and access required something they no longer had. Authorization. 8:24 a.m. The numbers started to matter. Every minute the system stayed offline. Orders failed. Contracts delayed. Revenue stalled. Thousands per minute. Then tens of thousands, scaling upward with every transaction that couldn't complete. I closed the message and turned back to the screen. The system had stabilized. In failure. No crashes, no recovery attempts. Just a clean, enforced shutdown of functionality. Exactly as defined. Exactly as agreed. Somewhere across town, people were trying to fix it, restarting servers, rechecking configurations, looking for anything that resembled a solution. But they were looking in the wrong place, because the problem wasn't inside their system. It never was. And by the time they realized that, they would already be too late to stop what came next. The first call came at 8:31 a.m. I let it ring. Then another, and another. Different numbers. Same urgency. By 8:40, my phone had become a steady vibration against the table, like something alive trying to get my attention. I didn't pick up immediately. I finished my coffee first. Only when the caller ID finally changed to something familiar did I reach for it. Virex Systems HQ. I answered on speaker and set the phone down without saying anything. Karis. The voice came sharp, strained. Adrian. I didn't respond right away. Karis. This is Adrian, he continued. Faster now. We have a critical outage. The entire system is down. Did you leave something running? Some kind of failsafe? I leaned back in my chair. I don't work there anymore, I said calmly. You made that very clear. This isn't a joke. He snapped. Everything is offline. Inventory, payments, vendor access. We're bleeding money right now. I glanced at the screen in front of me. I already knew. That sounds serious, I replied. Then fix it, he said, the edge in his voice breaking slightly. Whatever you did, reverse it. I didn't do anything. I said, the system is enforcing its license status. Silence. Then, lower now, more controlled. What does that mean? It means the agreement you ignored is now active. I said, did you process the licensing payment? We're not paying that. He said immediately, it's outdated. Legal hasn't even reviewed it yet. That's not how contracts work. I replied, you don't get to pause them because you don't understand them. I could hear voices in the background. Movement. Someone speaking urgently near him. Then another voice cut in. Deeper. Older. Put it on speaker. A pause. Then, Karis. This is Daniel Mercer, the CEO. Of course. Good morning, I said. We need to resolve this immediately, he said, skipping any pretense. Our entire operation is frozen. What exactly is happening? You're operating on unlicensed software, I replied. The system has revoked execution rights. That's not acceptable, he said sharply. It's not optional, I corrected. Another silence. He exhaled slowly, recalibrating. All right, he said. Let's be practical. What do you need to restore service? I didn't answer right away. Because this was the moment. The shift. You have two options, I said finally. I'm listening. Option 1, I continued. You rebuild your entire system from scratch. New architecture, new infrastructure, no dependencies on anything I built. Adrian let out a short, disbelieving laugh in the background. That's not realistic, he muttered. Exactly, I said. Daniel didn't interrupt. He already understood. And option 2, he asked. You acquire the system, I said. Fully, permanently. Source code, infrastructure rights, documentation, everything transfers to Virex. How much, he asked immediately. I looked at the screen in front of me, watching the numbers continue to climb. Every failed transaction, every stalled process, every minute costing them more than they were prepared to admit. Then I gave him the number. 2.6 million. Silence. Not confusion, not disbelief. Just the weight of calculation. That's excessive. Adrian cut in. This is extortion. No, I said calmly. This is valuation. Daniel didn't speak for a few seconds. Then, quietly, how long do we have? I glanced at the timer. Less than an hour, I said. After that, additional compliance protocols begin. I didn't explain what that meant. I didn't need to. He understood enough. We'll need confirmation that service will be restored immediately upon payment, Daniel said. You'll have it, I replied. The moment the transfer is complete, the system returns to full operation. Another pause. Then a decision. Send the agreement, he said. I reached for my laptop. Check your personal email, I replied. Corporate systems might not be reliable right now. I ended the call before Adrian could speak again. The room fell quiet. Not outside. Inside. Because the chaos was no longer mine to manage. I had already defined the outcome. Now, all that was left was to see whether they were willing to pay the price to fix their own mistake. I didn't move right away after ending the call. There's a strange stillness that comes after you set terms like that. Not relief, not satisfaction, just a quiet space where everything hangs in balance for a moment. I opened a new document and began drafting the transfer agreement. Clear terms, no ambiguity, full intellectual property transfer from Obsidian Core Labs to Virex Systems. Immediate wire payment required upon signature. System restoration guaranteed upon confirmation. No room for interpretation. I sent it within 3 minutes. Then I waited. The clock on my screen ticked forward with mechanical precision. Every second carried weight now. Not for me, but for them. My phone stayed silent for a few minutes longer than expected. Then it buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Legal has reviewed. Minor wording clarification needed on Section 2.3. I smiled slightly. Even now. They were negotiating. Even now. They thought they had time. I didn't reply immediately. I let 5 minutes pass before responding with a revised version. Not weaker, just clearer. Clean language leaves less space for arguments. Another pause. Then the call came again. This time, I answered immediately. This is Sharon Lee, General Counsel for Virex. The voice said, calm, controlled. Professional in a way Adrian never was. I've reviewed your agreement. She continued, we're prepared to proceed, pending confirmation of immediate system restoration upon payment. You'll have it, I said. The second the wire clears. We're initiating the transfer now, she said. Stay available. The line disconnected. I opened my banking app and set it beside the control panel. Time stretched again. Outside. Nothing had changed. Cars still passed. People still walked. The world kept moving as if nothing was happening. Inside Virex, everything was still burning. At 9:42 a.m., the notification appeared. Incoming wire transfer, $2,600,000. Source, Virex Systems. I stared at it for a second. Not because I doubted it, but because of what it represented. 6 years of work, compressed into a single number. I switched back to the control panel. License status breached. System state restricted. I placed my hand on the trackpad and paused. This was the final step. Not revenge, not victory, closure. I executed the update. License status active. Then the second command. Ownership transfer completed. The system responded instantly. Inventory module active. Vendor validation active. Transaction routing active. Green lights returned one by one. Clean, controlled, seamless. As if nothing had ever happened. My phone buzzed almost immediately. A message from Noah. It's back. Everything just came back. What did you do? I didn't answer. Another message followed. They're saying it's fixed. People are cheering. I leaned back in my chair. Cheering. That part almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because they still didn't understand. They thought the system had been repaired, recovered, saved. But the truth was simpler than that. They hadn't fixed anything. They had just paid to keep it alive. I closed the panel and shut the laptop. The silence returned. But this time, it felt different, lighter, final. The fight was over, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't have anything left to prove. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a very different office, glass walls again. But this time, they weren't meant to display control. They were meant to reflect confidence. The logo on the wall read Helixer Dynamics, Virex's biggest competitor. Bigger budget, bigger reach, and far more careful about who they underestimated. Across from me sat Marcus Hale, their director of engineering, older, sharper, the kind of person who listened before he spoke. I heard what happened, he said, folding his hands on the table. Not the official version, the real one. I didn't burn anything down, I replied calmly. I enforced a contract. He smiled slightly. That's exactly why you're here. He slid a folder across the table. We've been trying to solve our vendor compliance bottleneck for years, he said. What you built, it's faster than anything we've seen. I can't give you that system. I said, it's no longer mine, I know. He said, I don't want the old one. That made me pause. What I want, he continued, is whatever you build next. That was the difference. Virex had tried to own what already existed. Helixer wanted what didn't exist yet. I opened the folder. Full autonomy, a dedicated team, resources without interference, and a compensation package that made the $2.6 million look like a preview, not a peak. I looked up at him. No shortcuts. I said, no interruptions, and no one touches the architecture unless they understand it. Agreed. He replied without hesitation. I closed the folder. Then we'll build something better. 6 months later, Helixer launched a new platform, faster, cleaner, unbreakable in ways Virex never understood. Their system didn't just compete, it replaced, across the industry. Clients shifted, contracts moved, confidence followed performance. Virex didn't collapse overnight, but they never recovered their position. They had paid millions to keep the past alive, while I built the future somewhere else. Now, when I sit at my desk, I don't think about what happened there, not with anger, not with regret, just with clarity, because in the end, it was never about proving them wrong. It was about knowing exactly what I had built, and making sure I was the one who decided what happened to it next. There was a moment in that story when everything could have gone differently if I had chosen to stay silent, accept less, or let someone else define the value of what I built. But I didn't, and that's the point. Sometimes, people only realize your worth when you're no longer there to carry the weight for them. I've learned that being underestimated isn't a weakness, it's a quiet kind of power. When you truly understand what you own, what you've created, and what you deserve, you stop needing validation from others. You move with clarity, you make decisions with confidence, and most importantly, you protect your value without apology. In the end, this wasn't about revenge, it was about self-respect and knowing exactly when to walk away on your own terms. Through this story, I've taken away 5 lessons. First, always know your true value and what you actually own. Never let others define it for you. Second, confidence cannot replace real competence. The loudest voice is not always the smartest one. Third, silence at the right moment is a powerful strategy, not a sign of weakness. Fourth, the smallest details like contracts and terms can decide everything in the end. Fifth, walking away is not losing, as long as you leave with control and self-respect. What about you? What lesson did you take away from this story? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments. And if this story gave you something meaningful, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, like, and share it with someone who might need it today. Because when you spread stories like this, you're not just watching, you're creating value for others too.
Welcome to Boardroom Revenge Stories, a channel focused on workplace conflict, corporate betrayal, power struggles, and quiet justice. Our stories follow a structured workflow to deliver a consistent, immersive experience. We start by analyzing real discussions on Reddit, Facebook, Quora, and blogs. Next, we craft original scripts using AI tools like ChatGPT. We then use 11 Labs to transform text into high-quality voice and edit everything in CapCut for a smooth, cinematic finish. Thumbnails are designed with Canva, and every video is carefully reviewed before release. These stories go beyond entertainment, revealing how power truly